Hi, I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be continuing with Chapter 1. So, we're going to start with stakeholder mapping. But before I get into that, I just wanted to briefly review what we spoke about last section of this chapter, the role set, right? So, how one person can be a stakeholder in many different ways. An example that I thought of last week was how I live in Playa del Rey, right? And so I'm a member of the LMU community because I live in the neighborhood close to the university. I also teach at the university, right? And so now I have two roles, two stakeholder roles. My son goes to preschool at LMU. So now I have a third stakeholder. And the fourth thing is that I own an investment property in Westchester and I rent out my part of my investment property to LMU students, right? So I'm a landlord to LMU students. So as you can see, my stakeholder role is the set is full, right? I have four or five maybe different places where I participate in the LMU culture or the LMU world. So let's go ahead and hop into stakeholder mapping. A really nice way for organizations to see what the relationships are among stakeholder interests, power, and coalitions with respect to a particular issue. It says here, our stakeholder map is a useful tool because it enables managers to quickly see how stakeholders feel about an issue, right? How coalitions are likely to form, how powerful these coalitions are, and what outcomes are likely. The book spoke about the example of Disney and how this organization, SunCal, wanted to develop some land next to the Disney park, right? And so Disney did not want that because SunCal was only going to create housing and include some low income housing for potentially people who work at Disney or people in the area. But Disney thought that the land would be better used by them buying the property and expanding it for use with their theme park or for other organizations like hotels or restaurants to buy that property so that they would bring in more customers to then use their theme park, right? So when we look at this, right, we can see very quickly, right? Disney has a lot of power, right? They have a lot of money, they have a lot of resources, they have a great name, a big name. So they can very, quote, easily come in and put the kibosh, one would think, potentially on SunCal's plans. But there are coalitions out there, right? Unions, affordable housing advocates, et cetera. People who really want SunCal to move forward with their housing project. And so interest can be divided, right? So also maybe people in the neighborhood feel, those stakeholders feel that maybe the housing could be good, but then also the theme park things could be good. So some stakeholders might not necessarily have an opinion or a settled opinion. So this was a really nice example. Let's go ahead and hop into the next slide so we can see the actual map, the stakeholder map of SunCal's proposed development. And this, as we said, helps managers to see how stakeholders feel about this issue. And we start here with the higher power versus the lower power, right? So Disney is right up here at the top of the chart. We also see that Disney is opposing the issue, not supporting it. Local businesses probably are also have a lot of power because that is an area that just brings in tons and tons of money for the state of California and the area. So these are the coalitions in opposition. Then we have the city council, right? So those are people who are their interests are potentially divided at this moment. And then we work here through the coalitions who are supporting SunCal's efforts, right? The unions, the affordable housing, the environmental groups, right? They feel that the environmental groups that the housing would be better for the earth or better for the environment in general. So we're going to go through an example in class with an Uber case and do the same map. But I wanted to give you an idea first of how it would look in the Disney case. So let's hop into the next topic of stakeholder mapping. This is stakeholder salience, right? So this salient is a word that means stands out from a background, is seen as important or draws attention. Stakeholders stand out, in other words, they're salient to managers when they have power, legitimacy, and urgency, right? So one of the stakeholders, right? Disney, right? A lot of power, they're pretty legitimate, right? They bring in a lot of money for the country and for the state of California. And and yeah, time is money when it comes to Disney as well, right? So Disney is obviously a salient stakeholder. We can go through all the other stakeholders, but they get the idea of this term salience. So let's go ahead and move into the the next slide here, the corporation's boundary spanning departments. And so this is a complex issue or a complex topic, but so relevant when we get into the workplace, right? Because there are all these different departments with different needs and different wants and different resources that overlap. So in the next slide, it's going to be shown graphically, but just to describe it, these are departments or offices within an organization that reach across that dividing line that separates the company from groups and people in society. And the idea here is that we are building positive and mutually beneficial relationships across these organizational boundaries as a growing part of the management's role. And that's you, right? You all are destined to become managers in the business world. And so what we're teaching in this course here is for you to help build these positive and mutually beneficial relationships across these boundaries. Let's go ahead and hop into that slide, into that graph. So here you can see the boundary spanning departments. So we can start here. There are shareholders, there are customers, there's community, NGOs and suppliers, right? The general public, environment, employees, government. And each of these departments has different roles. So for example, and this is all within the corporation, obviously, right? So the shareholders relationships, investor relations, for me, super interesting job. I've had this job a few times in my life, and really cool because your job as an investor relation person is to communicate with the corporation and the people who are investing in the organization. And they have, right, a lot of stake in the game. They most likely put money in there. So they want to keep tabs on where their money is and how their money's working. So as an investor relations person, you help with the external and internal audits. You help with the SEC filings, which has to do with the United States government, compliance, communications in general, and then proxy election management. So, so when those shareholders have an opportunity to vote, then the investor relations person helps manage that process to make sure all those shareholders have that opportunity, and either by writing it in, or sometimes you do it on the computer, or they have a meeting. So I won't go through as much detail in all of these different departments, but you get the idea, right? Customer relations, that's probably more straightforward, right? You go to Target and there's a customer relations person there for the organization, and that customer relations person there is for the customer service, the total quality management, maybe the liability and lawsuit defense, and the recall management, right? So if things need to be returned due to defects, that's where the customer relationship person comes in. So again, a super interesting graph here where it describes the role of all of these different groups and departments and how they help the organization, and how these managers within these organizations are here to promote a mutual and beneficial relationship for all of the stakeholders. So this is a graph to look at, and maybe think that maybe one day you'd like to be a part of one of these groups, right? Maybe you want to be in public relations or corporate communications, or maybe you want to be in HR, etc. So you will all most likely have a role in this, in the corporation's boundary spanning departments. Good. Let's go ahead off into the next slide. So now we're going to talk about the external environment of business and how it's dynamic and ever changing. The purpose of the firm is not simply to make a profit, but to create value for all of its stakeholders, right? Not shareholders. A successful business must meet both of its economic and social objectives. And then there are 6 dynamic forces that powerfully shape the business and society relationship. We're going to go through these 6 in the next slide in much further detail. So these are the forces that shape the business and society relationship. Let's go ahead and start here with the growing emphasis on ethical values. So this is where the public nowadays because this is a relatively new term, right? Our grandparents in the 1950s and before didn't really worry too much about the the stakeholders in the organization, right? That, for example, my grandparents, they owned a Swiss watch company in Switzerland, and e- they were more concerned about profits, right? That yes, they worked in a small village, and yes, they had neighbors and competitors, but there wasn't as much pressure to do these types of things that we're going to talk about here on this slide, such as a growing emphasis on ethical values. I'm hopeful and pretty confident that they were ethical from what I've heard, but now the public wants companies to be ethical, right? So we're talking about like sexual harassment cases, um, hiring people of different colors, uh, lesbian gay rights, etc. So there's a huge emphasis now on ethical values, right? If you think back to your grandparents and great grandparents, they did not necessarily have these stresses or these influences on their organization. Let's hop into the next one, evolving government regulation of business. So this is where companies are more involved in government laws and ideas. And so this is a good thing and a bad thing, right? These are otherwise known as lobbyists. So there are people in this country who go out and lobby and try and influence government senators and congressmen to create laws that are in favor of the organization, right? So it's the fact, right? There are people who are, paid for by the NRA doesn't exist anymore, but that used to be, or paid for by the cigarette companies or by the pharmaceutical companies, right? Who then pressure um, and, work with senators and congressmen to, let's say, educate them on the opportunities that there are within these businesses. So more and more, and especially in the US, this doesn't happen in all countries, but that that businesses are very involved in government regulations. Let's move on to the third one here, globalization, one of my favorites, right? Because I have a degree in international business. I have my MBA in that. And so this is where products and people were move quickly across borders. Again, something that our grandparents and great grandparents did not have to deal with as much, right? That my parents had a Swiss watch company, but they sold primarily to Europe, right? It was only when my grandparents moved to the US that they opened up and this was in the 1940s, that they opened up the first international subsidiary. And it was a pretty large Swiss watch company. It still exists today. And so, right, globalization is something that is new because of the internet, because of airplanes, because of technology. We can now use products across borders much more easily than we could in the past. Then we're going to be talking about here explosion of new technology. So this kind of bleeds from globalization, right? I like to think of this as the fourth industrial revolution, right? So we had three industrial revolutions before. Textiles was the biggest one that I always think of, and the modernization of how we make clothing. And now here we are with the explosion of tech and IT and and high involvement computing. So Google, Facebook, right, were the leaders, and just the technology is moving faster and faster and faster. So these are again forces that shape the business and society relationship. So right, so as we can see right now, Facebook is very influential. Facebook is a stakeholder in many organizations because um, it promotes and separates news. So then we have a fourth dynamic environment here, a fourth factor, and this is known as climate change, drought, etc. And this is where we talk about a lot in this class how those things will affect the business and its stakeholders. And then the last one here is changing societal expectations. And this is where people expect companies to be responsible, right? They expect companies now to not just look the other way when it comes to society and helping nonprofits and helping others, etc. So, right, Salesforce is being one of those leaders, right? They have incorporated service into their doctrine. So if you were to ever work for Salesforce on the first day of your orientation, you spend a few hours in the classroom, but then you go out and you work at a soup kitchen, you work at a food bank, et cetera, because Salesforce is so involved in the organizations and the nonprofits in their area. So this completes the chapter one. Again, I'm Professor Green, and I am excited to study this semester with you. I look forward to the future chapters. All right, have a great day.